Okay, everyone. Welcome back. I'm going to have Dan Stuber up here to introduce Dr. Nowell.
Hello again, everybody. Good to see you all here. Thanks for coming tonight to hear Dr. Nowell's talk, and to all of you in Zoom land, welcome aboard. You're up for in for a really wonderful presentation. Dr. April Nowell is a Paleolithic archaeologist and professor of anthropology at the University of Victoria, British Columbia, Canada. She received her BA from McGill University in Montreal and her PhD from the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia. April directs an international team of researchers in the excavation of Lower and Middle Paleolithic sites in Jordan. She and her colleagues working in Jordan published the world's oldest identifiable blood residue on stone tools, demonstrating that 300,000 years ago, people ate a range of animals, including from ducks to rhinoceros. April is known for her publications on Paleolithic art, cognitive archaeology, Neanderthals, the archaeology of children, and much more. Her work has been covered by more than 100 news outlets, including the Washington Post, the Guardian, New York Times, and The Economist, and National Public Radio, just to name a few. She serves as a Smithsonian Journeys expert on their trips to visit the prehistoric painted caves of France and Spain. She is co-author of numerous volumes, including Archaeology of Night, Life After Dark in the Ancient World, and author of the book Growing Up in the Ice Age, which is the winner of the 2023 European Association of Archaeologists Book Prize. And the topic of her presentation tonight. And if you haven't seen, the book is up there, but here's another copy in person. So if you want to look at one of these copies and buy it, it's a fantastic read, I must say. So I have the great honor to introduce my dear friend and colleague, April Nowell.
Hey, can everyone hear me okay? Online as well, I hope. And okay. Well, thank you, Dan, so much for that introduction. I've known Dan for years and years and years. So I was really worried about what he might say. But it was very tame. So thank you, Barry. That was lovely. Whew, okay, got through what I thought was going to be the hardest part of the night. And I would also say that team of experts that did the identifying of the blood residue, Dan was part of that. And in fact, he was the guy who said, you know, we should see if there's any residue on these things. And I was like, no, they're too old. It'll never work. And luckily, Dan was persistent. So it's been such an honor working with him on this project. And such a privilege to be here with you. So thank you, and thank everyone for coming tonight and for the invitation to be here. It's such a pleasure. So I have so much I want to share, so I'm going to just jump right in to my talk. So when we think about prehistoric societies, Paleolithic societies, we often think about these ancestral landscapes that are peopled by adults. We think about them as people who hunted and fished and gathered and made art and so on. But we forget that these landscapes were actually also peopled by little people. They were filled with about half to 2/3 of the population back in the Paleolithic were made up of kids. And so these adults were not only hunters and fishers and so on, but they were also moms and dads, they were uncles, they were aunts, and they had to make space, literally and figuratively, for these children who were all around them. And about a year or two ago, when I was doing one of our Smithsonian Journeys trips, I was waiting to bring our group into a cave in Spain. And it was a school holiday, and there were all these children. And I was thinking, when you were talking about school field trips, all these lucky Spanish kids who got to go to a painted cave. And long before I saw these kids, I heard them, and they were laughing and talking and shoving each other, and their voices, the laughter was just echoing off the cave walls. And then they emerged into the sunlight. And I thought, yeah, this is what people would have heard, thousands of years ago. But we often forget that. And so what I would like to do today is to talk to you about why we've not studied kids as much, and what the evidence is for their lives, and then, of course, why we should be studying them. But before I get into all of this, I wanted to set the stage very briefly. There's a cave that some colleagues of mine have been studying. It dates to 14,000 years ago. It's a site called Basura Cave in Italy. It's right along the Italian Riviera, sort of where Monaco and Italy share a border. So I don't feel sorry for them at all, having to work in these really tough conditions down there. And they've just done this incredible work. And if I can sort of paint the scene for you, what they've discovered is that 14,000 years ago, as the ice sheets were retreating, a family of 4 individuals, what we think of as a mom and dad, or at least an adult male and female, a family of 5 with 3 kids, a toddler who's about 3, an older child of about 6, and an adolescent of about 11 years old. The 5 of them made their way across this sort of grassy landscape toward the cave, and it was covered with wildflowers and pinks and purples. And I don't know if it was a rainy day. I like to think of it as a rainy day in the Paleolithic, and they had nothing to do. So they gathered these pine boughs and wrapped them together, covered them with resin, and then lit them to use as a torch as this family of 5 made their way through the cave. And we know this, we see their footprints. They were in bare feet, so they made little footprints as they were going through the mud. I'm just going to call him the dad. The dad first, followed by the adult female, possibly the mom, and then these 3 children with the toddler in the rear. And we can see that they stayed close to the wall as they were making their way through with only the light of the torch. And then this sort of chamber started to get more and more narrow. It was under 3 feet, and they had to crawl on their hands and knees. And we see the knee imprints as they're doing this. And then it got even more narrow. And then dad stops, and we can see he rocks back on his feet, and he's thinking, I imagine he might be thinking, can I get the kids through this or not? And then they decide to press on, and they pass blocks and stalagmites and make their way through a pond. And eventually they come into this big, big chamber, which archaeologists today call the Chamber of Mysteries. And what they did there was the adults made handprints with charcoal on the ceilings, and the kids dug the clay out of this sort of muddy clay sediment on the ground. They covered one of the stalagmites with it, and then they drew with their fingers in it, with the littlest one with the tiniest fingers near the bottom, and the older one at the top, and the middle one in the middle. And at some point, either they'd finish what they were going to do, or they decided you know, they were bored with doing that. For whatever reason, they're finished. We know from looking at the spacing of the footprints, they didn't stay there that long. And then on the way out, they decide to not go the same way they came in, but they go through an upper chamber that's bigger and drier and so on. And when I first started giving talks like this one, I would say, you know, and I wish there had been like a saber-toothed tiger that had come out and snatch the toddler and run off or something. So I would have like an exciting ending to my story. And I was doing this for a CBC radio program, and they said, you can't say that. This is a family show. You can't say that. So I don't do that ending, which didn't happen. We actually know they got out safely, or, you know, there's no evidence they didn't get out safely. But in some ways, I think that kind of ending for me is more compelling because we can all imagine, right? We can all imagine going camping or hiking on a rainy day. I forgot to mention that there's some canine footprints, so there might have been a family pet in tow. We don't know for sure, but maybe. So we can all, I think, imagine ourselves doing exactly this on a rainy day anywhere outside of Portland here, for example. But this story took place in Italy 14,000 years ago. And I think that it really changes what we think we can know about the past and what we think about how life, you know, how life was lived in so long ago in the Ice Age. Okay, so why, if kids are they're so present, they're everywhere, and they're probably huge parts of people's lives, why were they understudied? And I think there are a few reasons. I'm just going to go through them very briefly. But I think that we weren't really, as archaeologists, studying children until recently, partially because of taphonomy. As all of you who are archaeologists in the room know, all things being equal, denser, heavier bones preserve better than lighter ones, right? So we can think of, you know, elephant bones versus bird bones, for example, and children being along that lighter continuum. So children's bones are smaller, they're more porous, they lack they're lacking mineralization and tensile compression, compressive strength, and so on and so forth. And they can be very vulnerable to sedimentary pressure, to biodegrading because of contact with organic matter, and so on and so forth. We can also miss children's bones through excavator bias. So again, as all of you in this audience know, depending on the screen size you're using, you may miss the tiny deciduous teeth if you're not specifically screening for those, if you're not really looking for them. And I can give an example later of some work I did in South Africa, where we had tiny, tiny, tiny early Homo teeth, you know, children's teeth from 2 million years ago, precisely because we changed the way we were doing our screening and our sorting. So kids can be missed. They cannot preserve as well, and then even if they do, they can be missed more easily. Children are sometimes often given differential mortuary treatment. So they might not be buried in the same place. They might be on the periphery, or they might not have a marked burial, or, you know, any number of differences that might make them easy to be missed by an archaeologist. And I always want to emphasize that doesn't mean they're not loved. It just might mean, depending on people's notions of personhood, they might be treated a bit differently in burial. For a paleoanthropologist like myself, sometimes children's contributions are also undervalued, I would say, when we're thinking about new species. So as paleoanthropologists, when we find a new species, we define or coin what we call a holotype. So that's one single specimen that's said to represent all of a species. And so I have an example here of the late Professor Philip Tobias holding the Tong child skull, and the Tong child, who's maybe, depending on different opinions, around 4 to 6 years old, was the very first Australopithecus africanus ever found. And this was in 1925 or 24, 25. And people didn't believe this discovery at first. There was a whole bunch of reasons. Partially, people thought nothing new could come out of South Africa, so there was a lot of bias and so on. And the discoverer Raymond Dart mixed his Greek and Latin up in the name, and they said anyone who mixes up Greek and Latin can't know anything about anatomy. But one of the main reasons that they didn't like this new species was because it was a child, and they said, it looks kind of like a human fetus or human baby. And if you've ever seen the skull of an infant, human infant, and a chimp infant, they look kind of similar. But what happens when it grows up? Maybe it'll have these giant canines and all sorts of other things. And, maybe it won't be very human-like at all. So it wasn't until they found adults of this species that the Tong child was given its due. Also, people think that children distort the archaeological record. So there's this idea that children's play is just random and unpredictable. And so children have been described as not only unknown, but unknowable. And so children are often used as cautionary tales for archaeologists. So if you found something in a weird place, you would say, that's just a child playing with it, as if that's a nothing explanation and something easily dismissed. And what I and my colleagues have always said is that actually children add to the biography or the life history of an object. So if you have a plate that's broken and then those pieces are used as game tokens, for example, by a child, that's just the next stage of that artifact's life. And so children only distort the archaeological record if you think your job is, as archaeologists, is to reconstruct adult behavior. But if you think your job is to reconstruct human behavior, which is what I think we all think we're supposed to be doing, then they don't distort it. They just add to the richness of the archaeological record. And then we also have this perception of children's agency. We undervalue or underestimate what kids can do. And I teach a course on the archaeology of children. And the very first class, I say to people, when I say child and childhood and children, what words do you think of? And they always say things like naive, innocent, playful, and phrases like, needing to be taught and all of those things. And it's this idea that these children are these empty vessels that you just fill with knowledge. And any of you who are parents know that that's not the case. Kids actually are quite active, and I'm going to talk about this at the very end of my talk in terms of what they learn and also what they can do. So we know ethnographically and archaeologically that children contribute socially, politically, economically, and spiritually to the communities of which they are part. The idea that children did nothing is not true today, and it was never true in prehistory at any time and anywhere. So herding, fetching water, harvesting, doing all these sorts of things, acting as child soldiers, being musicians in times of war, child kings of Egypt and the Mayan child kings. Children have always been an active part of our past. So they're not fully autonomous, but they're not fully constrained either. And then finally, I think children have been marginalized as a research topic. It's because it's kind of similar to the bias that we had in archaeology back in the day, where we felt that we could only reconstruct men's activities in the past, that they were our default category. And it took people in the 70s, colleagues of mine at the University of California, at Berkeley in particular, to come along and really push us to look at our data again and ask interesting questions about women. And as Margaret Conkey, and maybe some of you know her, says, and we don't just add women in stir, we have to really think about a new way of, our interesting questions that we want to ask. And it's the same way here. I'm not just adding children and stirring to the pot. I'm trying to ask interesting questions about their lives. And so it's part of a movement of diversifying voices in the past, looking for diverse genders, diverse sexualities, ethnicities, ages, and so on. Although I will say that seniors in the archaeological record are still terribly understudied. And so there's all kinds of biological perspectives and evidence about the lives of kids that I'm not going to cover tonight because I don't have time, but I would be happy to come back to any of this in questions and answers. But we can look at life history data and the extension of childhood throughout our evolution, so over millions of years. We can look at things like breastfeeding and weaning. And there's so much work being done with ancient DNA and new ways of sexing individuals using polypeptide analysis. And we can get information on diet and so on. And I'd be happy to talk more about a project I've just finished on looking at puberty in Ice Age teenagers that will be released in a press release on in about 10 days from now. So, but happy to talk about that tonight as well. Okay, but moving into the heart of the talk, what is our archaeological evidence for the lives of Ice Age kids? Well, sometimes the easiest way to see a child is actually to see them. And so what we have here are some things that are supposed to be images and figurines of children. So we have something called a plaquette from the site of La Marche in France, and that's all the way on your right there on the screen. And that's a site from 14,000 years ago where we have all of these what are called plaquettes. They're just basically thin pieces of limestone that people have engraved. And these are thought to be the faces of children. And it's because of the ratio of the eyes and the overall size of the face, what we call the cute gestalt. It's what Walt Disney drawer animators use to great effect to make us fall in love with their characters. It's that same kind of ratio. We also have in the middle some engravings from a Magdalenian site around 12 to 14,000 years ago in Germany. And these are supposed to be stylized women, so they don't have any heads. I don't know if I can orient you, but you're supposed to be able to see the breasts and then their buttocks there. Can you see my, oh yeah, you can see my cursor. Okay, so breasts here, no head, and buttocks here, so very stylized females. But there's supposed to be a little one here in the red box, and it's tied to the back of this other one through engraved lines here. So what some people think is that this might be an incredibly rare image of a woman carrying a child on her back 12 to 14,000 years ago. And then we have lots of ivory figurines, mammoth ivory figurines from sites in Siberia, this one in particular from Malta, where there are supposed to be lots of children and adolescents, again, looking at head to body ratio and so on. And I don't have an image of it here, but a lot of them have clothing and so on. And one of them is supposed to have a little backpack. I don't know. I've read about it, but I haven't seen it. So that's one I want to track down. So that's kind of all we have really for images of children. But then we also have other ways of knowing them directly, which is through their tiny handprints. And this is one I took when I was in Australia. I work at a rock art site that's about 30,000 years old in Australia. And then we have thousands literally of footprints in the Paleolithic, and a good portion of them, I would say even the majority, belong to children. And we have evidence of them playing tag, and we have evidence at this site of Nowell of them balling up pieces of rolling mud together, kind of like a snowball, but a mud ball, and throwing it at each other and throwing them at stalactites. And sometimes they hit the mark and sometimes they splat next to it on the ground. And you can see again that they're running, and a couple of times there is also looks like a canine footprints, which may or may not be associated with them. But we have evidence of sort of the playfulness of children by looking at their footprints, and we find them in a number of different caves. And then we also have burials. And for a long time, we studied burials as a way of knowing a child's death, right? And it was the real way we focused on kids because we knew it was a child's skeleton. It's confined in a space, so any artifacts with them are associated with kids. And that was really the focus. And so, as my friend said, we kind of, as archaeologists, started to focus on dead children instead of dead living children. In other words, we focused on their deaths. We didn't focus on the lives that they were leading up to that point. But burials can tell us so much about relationships because, as all of you know, when someone dies, it's the community that decides how to place these individuals in the burial, how to honor them or remember them, and so on. And so we have a whole bunch. I'll just go very quickly here. We have some twins buried together in Austria around 31,000 years ago. We always assumed they were twins, but we didn't know until they did an ancient DNA study recently. And they died about a couple of months apart. They have a cousin who's buried nearby who died a few months later. And they're buried with ochre. One of them seems to have been wrapped in a shroud because the ochre is so delimited around the body. And there's a little ivory pin at the top, so it probably closed the shroud. And so on. Above them are 3 teens that we just finished studying for our puberty study. And they date to around 25,000 years ago. This is one of the weirdest burials I've ever seen. 3 teens, we don't know how they died. We know they died or they were buried at once. And 2 of them are sort of engaged in one way. You can see one is reaching his hand, they're all male, reaching his hand over to the pelvis of the other one, and there's tons of ochre at that point of union. The other individual is looking away. He's on his stomach. He's looking in the other direction, and that's very typical for this time period. There are, well, I wouldn't say typical, but there are multiple triple burials like that where 2 people are involved and one is more isolated. And there's all kinds of other weird stuff, but don't have time, but I'll come back to it if you want. And then we have this individual, this young child from La Madeleine in France. I don't know it's a girl. The artist that I hired to do the drawing decided to make her a girl, so that was fine. And she's associated with all of these dentalium beads. And so in order to make the clothing that these beads were on, you can just imagine, not only did they have to make the clothing she was wearing, but they had to collect all these beads and saw them so that they're really tiny and they're all very standardized. If you go to Southwest France, you can see all of these in a museum in Les Uzis still. And then they had to make all the thread. And then the holes are so tiny and they had these tiny, tiny needles, these ivory needles that they made. And it looks like they embroidered all these beads onto this girl's clothing. And we can see that they were worn in life too, because there's wear on the beads. And so it wasn't purpose made, but you can imagine the amount of time and effort that went into it. And then they took all of that out of circulation and put it into the burial. So for me, that speaks to the grief of people at this individual's passing. And then finally, one of my favorites is this individual with dwarfism, a 16-and-a-half-year-old young man who I don't know why I didn't use. I have another image where I show him being buried in the arms of someone that we think is his mom. We're not sure. But this is another skeleton that I got to study for our puberty paper. And again, it's a very simple burial, but the community decided to bury them together in each other's arms. And so that speaks to the relationship between them and the relationship between them and the community. And we also know from studying his remains that he was eating all the same meat-rich diet that everyone else was eating, even though he would have had trouble keeping up with his peers when hunting. We also have some toys or possible toys from the Paleolithic. So some people think that some of the figurines may have acted as toys. I don't know. I'm going to put that out there for you. So this is the Lion Man, and this is one idea that's out there. We also have little things that look like whistles. We have tiny hand axes and so on, so tiny weapons, tiny spears. We have those clay pellets that I was talking about that they threw at each other. And then we also have these things called thaumatropes, which are just fabulous. They're my favorite object. We don't get a lot in my time period. All my friends are Mayanist, so I get so jealous of them. But one thing that we have that's super cool are these thaumatropes. They're basically pieces of ivory or stone or bone. They're made into little discs, and there's an image drawn on either side or geometrics drawn on either side. I don't know if any of you had flip books when you were kids and you would just flip it and a whole story would unfold along the edges. Well, that's what this is. You're looking at two sides of the same thaumatrope. And so basically, if you put a cord through it and you tug it back and forth, what you have is the object flipping back and forth. And because of retinal persistence, the images start to blend. And so I have a friend who's published on this and said, oh, it's a doe in the throes of dying. And I said, I don't think so. I think because, her body stays in that same plane, but it's her legs that are going up and down. So I don't think she's collapsing to the ground. I think she's actually springing. I think she's actually, moving, jumping around. I think they call it spronking or something. I'm not an expert, but that's what it looks like to me. And her ears are apparently, colleague of mine knows deer better than I do and says her ears are back in a playful way and so on. And so this might have been, just the ideal subject for this kind of toy. And it's something that adults probably love too. And we have a number of these in the Upper Paleolithic. So the idea of visual play, I think we think about these people as always having to eke out their next meal, like that's all they're thinking about, they're hungry all the time or whatever. And we forget that they have time for all of these kinds of objects. And there's so much humor in their cave art, which is a whole other talk. But I just want to point that out there, that they had time for this kind of thing. We also have what are called secret spaces and small places. So space is not culturally neutral, as my friend Jane Baxter reminds us. You have to learn how to use the space around you, your landscapes, and where you can go and not go. And for any of you who had forts or tree houses as kids, so desperately wanted tree house, but you can't really put one in a pine tree so easily. So we didn't have one. But I did make a fort underneath in the snow in the winter. And for any of you who had that kind of a thing, if you remember, the best thing is that your parents couldn't see you, right? You were hidden away, and you could bring snacks. For me, that was always like bringing cookies and bringing comic books into this snow fort was just heaven for me. And what we see at this at this site here, a Magdalenian site called Étiole. It's just outside of Paris. We have some regular larger settlements where people are making food, making tools, doing all that stuff. And then if you can see those smaller ones, J18 and G13, they're just out of sight of the other two. They're just down under, like beyond a ridge. And they have animal bones with cut marks on them, but they also have stone tools that look like they're made by novices. They're using worn out old flint. They're making really, novice errors and so on. And some people have suggested maybe you've got, a Paleolithic fort, for the lack of a better word. And then these small spaces, we also look for children in places that are too small to have accommodated adult bodies. And so when I was working with a colleague of mine in Spain at a site that had cave art in it, there is a ledge right near the bottom, and under that ledge are tiny, tiny traces of children's fingers making what we call finger flutings. And she and I had to lie on the ground to be able to look up and record them. And where we work in Australia is a place called the Squeeze, and that's where we also are going to look for small hands as well, because that's really hard to accommodate an adult body. But the rest of the cave is full of adult traces. And then we have, of course, lots of stone tools, and we have, so we can look at a whole variety of errors and so on, and we can look at the quality of the raw material and all sorts of things that I can go into in more detail in questions and answers, if you like, that are what we call archaeological signatures of novices. And we know this by doing, as again, many of you are probably way better flint knappers than I am, through experimental studies, through refits, through ethnographic research, and so on, and we can pull these things together. What we know, though, about all of this is it really emphasizes the social aspects of learning, or what we call situated learning, which is so important for learning any kind of craft today and in the past. And at a site in France called Solvieux, what we have is a really interesting case of where you have a novice who's working on the edge of a site, and clearly comes to an impasse. There's some thing that they can't, some problem they can't solve. And so they go to the center of the site near the hearth where there's an expert working, and we can see that because we can see the debris from that expert flint napper or stone tool maker. And then obviously that person gets some help because their flakes start to mingle, and we see the novice and the expert's stuff together. And then at some point, the expert's tools are taken away for some other purpose, and the novices are left in place. So by taking sort of a forensic look and being able to trace the movement of one individual at one moment in time, you get that snapshot of social learning. At other sites in France and Japan, other Upper Paleolithic sites, we have novices working at the center rather than the periphery of the site, maybe to get direct help, maybe just to listen to stories, and so on. So again, it's that social aspect of it. And then finally, what we have here is what I call the, intangible culture, intangible heritage of these individuals. And when we talk about that a lot today, we talk about people's songs and dances and so on as being an intangible heritage of a group of people. And we can talk about that in the Paleolithic as well. We often think about direct teaching in hunter-gatherer societies or forager societies. Anthropologists have always said, oh, they don't have direct teaching the way we do in schools today with a teacher and instructing pupils and so on. But what a colleague of mine, Michelle Scaly Sugiyama, which some of you may know because she's I'm blanking on which university she's at, but it's in Oregon. And she's been really focused on looking at the storytelling traditions of people, and her work is phenomenal. And so what she has shown is that oral storytelling has a lot of the same features as what we would call direct teaching or direct pedagogy. And so if you can imagine, what you have is a storyteller who is a knowledge keeper, right? Who has knowledge that he, she, they want to impart to the next generation. And so often they'll say, well, here's something you need to know after I'm gone. And that signals the beginning of a story. And then they'll talk about stories with humans and animals with human-like characteristics and ancestors. And there's usually a journey that they're going on, and they vary the timbre of their voice. They use gestures. They sometimes use objects. They can draw in sand or on cave walls and so on while they're telling this story to bring it really to life. But what's really amazing in these stories is that they often include extraneous, what we think of as extraneous detail. So instead, not just the main plot moving forward, but they include information about what kinds of plants are dangerous, or what ones are safe to eat, or where to go in times of drought and whatnot. And so some of the work that I've been doing, and then now starting to collaborate with Michelle, is to look at how Ice Age art may have been a visual component to some of these stories. So we've lost the meaning of or the details of these stories, but the art remains. And so that's some work that we're doing now. I'm also working on we've just published a paper with some other colleagues looking at children's evidence for children making ceramics in the Ice Age. And I can go through that again in a question and answer section. So we have all of this evidence here as well of children making handprints, of children doing finger flutings, of making ceramics, and probably learning through all of these images that surrounded them. They were living in a very rich visual culture. So just to wrap up then, children, the question is, why should we be studying Paleolithic kids? Well, we could say, well, they're worthy of study in and of their own selves. We don't excuse why we study mammoths, and we don't explain why we study stone tools. We're all here because we do this kind of thing and we love it, and we think it's, just the most natural thing. But when I'm in an Archaeology of Childhood conference, year after year, speaker after speaker, to a room full of people who only do this, everyone starts with a slide that says, well, children were 50 to 65% of the population in the past, just like I did tonight to justify it. So they are worthy of study, in and of them on their own selves. But in addition, if we think about what a large amount of the population kids take up, and you think that the Paleolithic represents over 99% of our time on this earth as humans, then if we don't study children, we're missing a huge amount of the human story. But the other reason that I think that we should be studying children is that I think what I've been arguing is that children, and particularly teenagers, who often get a bad rap from the adults around them, are drivers of human cultural evolution. And the reason why I say this is that as a child grows and develops, they have a lot to learn to become full members of their society, right, of their communities. But as I mentioned earlier this evening, they're not passive learners. They often decide who or what they want to learn and who they want to learn from. And this really becomes ever more important as they become teenagers. As all of you who are parents know, at first, your word means everything to your children. You're the, most brilliant person on the planet. And then as they get older, they seem to think you know nothing. So as they get to be teenagers, it's like, yeah, whatever, mom. But so you go from this sort of vertical teaching to horizontal with other peers to then what we call oblique, where teenagers in particular seek out, they're not innovators themselves, but they seek out people that they think are innovators. and they learn from them. And then they're the ones to adopt early technology, early ideas, and then spread it to others. And we know this through extensive research, not only in Western industrial societies, but looking at hunter-gatherer, forager teens as well. And I'm sure all of you remember, I remember helping my parents learn how to program a VCR, because that's how old I am. And now my children help me with everything, basically, that has to do with technology. And so, and when we think about our culture, of course, everything that we would need to survive in a challenging environment, like people did in the Paleolithic, is more than one person can hold in their brain, but it's something that has to be shared, that we can draw on the information from those around us. And that's what archaeologists call cumulative culture. It's that sum total of knowledge that we bring together as a people and that we pass onward. And we talk about that as having a ratchet effect, you know, that it relentlessly moves forward. But of course, not everything gets carried forward. Some things aren't relevant anymore. We were talking the other day about, you know, rotary phones. I asked my students, how many of you have used rotary phones? And then I have to stop and explain what a rotary phone is. And then they're like, oh, no, I haven't. But then I asked them, how many of you have played with a Fisher-Price phone that you draw on a string? And always about half of them have, because their parents still remember what a cool toy that was and give them to their kids. But all of that to say, some things aren't relevant anymore. Some ideas have changed. Some things just get forgotten. Stories that you read as kids, for example, just get forgotten somehow. And so, and it's really children who decide what they're going to bring forward to that next generation. One very quick example I wanted to give in relation to stories and situated learning and the importance of children bringing this knowledge forward is, I don't know if any of you remember the terrible tsunami that happened in Indonesia in 2004, right around New Year's Eve or New Year's Day. So many more people survived that than they would have expected, given, you know, the suddenness of it and the, you know, just how devastating it was. And they asked people and they said, well, how did you know what to do? And, you know, there were signs and so on, but people said it wasn't because we'd ever experienced one. Like, tsunamis are so rare, right? This is the only time in our life we've ever seen one. But to a person, they all said, but we remembered the stories that our parents and our grandparents told us again and again about how to survive a tsunami. And so when it happened, it just kicked in, like that knowledge just came right back, and we knew what to do. And so for me, that's such a beautiful example of that idea of carrying that social knowledge forward. So in conclusion, we've looked at reasons why children are understudied in the archaeological record. But I hope I've shown that far from being invisible, there's actually multiple lines of evidence that document their presence and also their contributions. And I've tried in my own work to emphasize the importance of studying children for who they are instead of just the adults that they're going to become, which is where I started my work. But I've sort of changed my perspective on what's interesting about them. And so I just want to emphasize that these are children who, as we can see from their burials, from their toys, from all of these things, who loved and were loved. They hunted and fished, and as I said, we have evidence for them making art and ceramics, and we know from their footprints and their clay pellets that they played games and so on. And as we saw at the very, very beginning with the very first vignette, sometimes they also left tiny footprints in the mud. Thank you.
All right. I'll grab the Omni mic so that you can hear me. But we'll go ahead and open it up for Q&A for anybody who's interested in asking questions. Thank you for that delightful talk.
Oh, pleasure.
I'm sure there's some questions out there. Anybody have anything? All right.
more about the Queensbury burial and why that's so weird. Specifically, I'm curious if anyone has theories about try to repeat that. Queensbury burial. My question was about the 3-teen burial. Particularly how you said how there was other sites in this one where they were positioned the same way. Were they close together, those sites, or was it like really far apart? That's just very peculiar to me.
Yeah, it's such a good question. And so, so this is taking place during the Gravettian, which is around 30,000 to about 22,000 years ago. And so there aren't a lot of burials from this time period, but they're more so than what we see in, so the upper Paleolithic goes from 40 to about 12,000, and the Gravettian is from 30 to 22. So the second big cultural period in this time. And that's where we find like sort of a jump in burials. Before that, we don't have very many, and we still don't have very many. I think I estimated it would be like the equivalent of one every, I can't even remember how many generations now, but like just like a really small number. And so, so being buried at all is weird or unusual, but these ones are even more interesting because there are these triple burials. We have double, but particularly triple burials. This one is from the Czech Republic, from Czechia, but we also have them in Italy as well. And it usually, as I say, there's two people who are interacting and a third person who's looking away. So two will be on their back looking at each other, for example, and the other one's on their stomach looking away, or some variation on that. So this one we can see, as I say, they were all buried at once. One of them is staked down, so he has a stake through you can't see it in this picture, but a stake was found with a stake through the pelvis. Some of these individuals have pathologies to them as well. They're buried with tons of ochre and weapons and so on. All three are males. We used to think the one in the middle was female because they have certain kinds of pathologies that are often associated with females. And then they did ancient DNA and found out that wasn't correct. Some of the things that they thought were also pathological, when my colleague Mary Lewis and I went back to look at them about a year ago, we realized they're just normal variation. So sometimes because we get so few, it's bad this is being recorded, even among us. Sometimes paleoanthropologists who look at skeletons can sometimes overemphasize the pathologies that they see. But my friend Mary normally works in the Middle Ages with medieval skeletons. And she would say, if I saw this in a medieval skeleton, I would just say, this is a really robust person who's using their right arm a lot, like these are people who are fishing or they're hunting and there's something, and so if you look in the literature, they're described often as being super pathological, but we didn't see a lot of that. There are some interesting things about them, but not quite as weird. But all of that to say that a number of these burials have what we call bad deaths. So they're either some kind of significant pathology, or there's some evidence of violence or something, so that some reason why they've had not an easy death, so a bad death, as they describe it. I don't know if that answers your question. So we don't know why. I guess the other thing I would add to that is that for me, like there's some drama being played out here because these bodies have been laid out in a very specific way. They didn't happen to be that way randomly. And so there's something that's being communicated, but we don't know what that is. So, yeah.
Question up here.
How was the 16-and-a-half-year-old male dated? With the dwarfism, I would think that could distort age.
Yeah, so actually it's a much more complete skeleton than what you can see here. I don't know why. I have a much better image that I can show you on my laptop later. This is just one that's been published before. So Mary Lewis, who literally wrote the book on paleopathology of adolescent skeletons, as well as another book on juvenile osteology. So she's really an expert in her field, but it's not my area. But she looked at the entire skeleton, as well as we had dental records and things like that, and put all of those things together and came up with an age of 16.5. What is kind of interesting for us is that when we were looking at that in relation to, so we did the puberty study where, based on, again, this is developed by Mary Lewis and her colleagues, but looking at clinical data to be able to make connections between changes in the skeleton and that happen at specific stages throughout puberty. And so she's done it with thousands and like literally thousands of skeletons, but she'd never worked with someone with dwarfism before. And so it's such a good question that you're asking, because we tried to see, would it delay puberty in any way? Would it change, but there's so little literature out on puberty in people with dwarfism. So everything we can see with this young man is that he was hitting all of the stages at exactly what we would expect for someone today. In fact, all of our kids, that's the big punchline for 10 days from now, is that these Ice Age kids are quite healthy, and they're entering puberty just a little bit later than than kids in industrialized societies today, which is not what you would expect. But to come back to your question, does dwarfism impact any of this? There's so little literature out there, but from what we could see, it didn't. So, yeah.
Got a question up here?
For the Paleolithic cave art created by children, what's the evidence of it being self-directed play versus ritual or under adult tutelage?
So yeah, so we used to think that when you would have footprints in these caves, that it was all, some kind of coming of age ritual or something like that. But we don't really see that in the caves where we've been able to find evidence for children. It seems like the minimum number of children seems to be around 4 to 6. So if this was a place where people were coming back again and again for some kind of as they say, puberty ritual or something like that, we would expect to see more children than that. So there doesn't seem to be any evidence. We haven't found any evidence to suggest to us that it's ritual. In fact, it does seem to be much more of a playful kind of thing. One thing that we do have that's kind of interesting is that in cave art, not only do we have like the typical animals, the mammoths and so on, but we have non-figurative signs, these geometric signs. They're wavy lines and all sorts of different, dots and all kinds of things like that. There's one called the tectiform, and they're just given these names to be to describe their shape. So tectiform meaning structure-like or house-like, and it's basically like an arrow like this with a line, and then sometimes they have a line underneath. So that's why people think they look kind of like a house. We have one of those at a site called Ruffignac in Southwest France, where there's an adult hand, like a big hand that's drawn one of these tectiforms, and then next to it is a small hand that's drawn a smaller version of that. And we know it came second because it crosses over that larger one, so which was obviously laid down first. So there's one case where it, I don't want to overly romanticize it, but it does maybe look like someone was copying someone at, like a smaller person was copying a more adult person's, making of signs.
Burial shaft at Puerca.
Oh, yeah. Did you have a question of?
Your take on that, what's been studied?
Oh, so Atapuerca is, so I'll do a shameless plug for the tour that we do with the Smithsonian, but that's the last site we go to is Atapuerca. It's just outside of Burgos in Spain, and it is amazing. And it's one of these, it's not even just one site, it's multiple sites. And you're kind of literally walking through time as you walk down this corridor. Basically, it's one of these classic situations where they were going to put a train through and they were going to mine and do all this stuff. And then they came down on all of these skeletons. And so they have Neanderthals there, they have pre-Neanderthals, they have these other individuals that could be Homo erectus, could be something else. There's some Homo SP, like they're not 100% sure what these are. And it's a rich series of sites, and it'll be several lifetimes before they finish excavating them. They're just meters and meters of deposits. But one of the cool things is this I forget if they call it the Cave of Bones or something like that, but it's like this giant shaft where they've got all of these skeletal remains. And so people have suggested, is it where they've thrown people in? Is it like a burial pit? Did people fall there accidentally? Most people think that they were placed there on purpose. There's one hand axe in there, and everyone freaks out because they think that it's, grave goods with these individuals. But personally, I think it fell in accidentally. There's only one. That's why. So I just and they're open to that idea as well. There's grad students who give the tours, and they're like, or it could just have fallen in. So that's my point of view on that. It's probably accidental.
When I was there.
Oh yeah. So yeah.
A botanist, that every single plant that I saw was food or medicinal.
Yeah.
I saw nothing in that whole time that I was at that large site that I couldn't think of a use for.
Oh yeah, I'm sure of it. Yeah, I'm sure. I think we actually often underestimate how much people know about plants because we find animal bones. And so our vision is, stones and bones in the past, as we always say. But the more we do take soil samples and do flotation and do all of those things, the more evidence we get for plants. So we have Neanderthals in Jordan where I work and where Dan works, where we have evidence of pistachios and all kinds of things like that. And, even chimpanzees, even your dog will know to eat grass, right, when it needs to vomit. And so chimpanzees know a lot about the medicinal uses of plants. And so Neanderthals would be like, even, far more complicated. And so now that people are studying the dental plaque, the kind of the tartar that people your dentist scrapes off your teeth. Now that they're studying that, they can see that Neanderthals were boiling some of these plants to make them more palatable or take out poisons or whatever. In the Gravettian, we have evidence of people grinding up flour to make what looks like plants to make what looks like flour. So people were experimenting with plants for thousands of years before agriculture, for sure. So I'm totally in agreement with you. Yeah.
I'm seeing 2 more questions here at OMSI, and then I haven't seen any on the chat yet. But put in your questions now if you have any.
Yeah, could you go back to the child burial from the Madeline?
Sure. Yeah.
Would that be typical outfits? I mean, would that, do you think it was also intricate with other people?
Yeah. So I just finished, I'm actually just going to grab my cord because I'm realizing my computer is going to die. So I'm going to just talk loudly. So I just finished a paper called The Best Dressed Hominin, and it's all about what we know about Paleolithic clothing. And I worked with, thanks, hon. And I worked with a colleague of mine. Actually, Dan knows her. I worked with Aurora Scala on that. And she's a phenomenal weaver and someone who makes her own leather out of salmon skins and all of those sorts of things. But she's super knowledgeable. And between the two of us, we put together this paper looking at all the different the evidence for textiles and clothing, and so leather working, bead making, and there is lots and lots of evidence to show that we have these far more tailored clothing. So we have tons and tons of these very fine ivory and bone needles, for example, and we have tools that look like they've been used for weaving. We have some strands from why am I blank? The Republic of Georgia, where we have spun dyed flax, and the colors are I think blues and greens in that case. Some of the figurine from Malta that I was oh, it doesn't want to advance for some reason. The figurine that I was showing of the from Siberia, those ones have traces of reds and blues and greens on them. So they were making those kinds of colors. We just don't see that in the cave art, but we think that they were using that for their clothing. And so anyways, if you're ever interested, I can send you the paper, because we kind of look at the larger implication of how do you schedule, you know, the seasonally available resources, and what happens if a plant you were going to use for dyeing all of a sudden has to be eaten or used for medicinal purposes, or, you know, how do you make those switches, you know, and how do you protect clothing if that's your one garment that you've got, you know, from, you know, mold or moths or, you know, any of those other things. And then we also look at, and what does it mean to wear the clothing or the parts of animals? Like, what does it mean to put on these sorts of skins and so on? Anyways, it was a really fascinating kind of exploration. And so, yeah, I think that's actually a very accurate thing for how they looked. We do have evidence of headgear. We have evidence of shoes or shod feet anyways. Whoops, sorry. I talked too much and I didn't plug this in. I hope we didn't lose them completely. Sorry about that. Anyways, does anyone else have a question from while I'm trying to?
Right here.
Okay. Plug this in. I'm sorry, I didn't hear that at all.
Archaeologists that support the idea of studying children.
Are there any Neolithic archaeologists?
Because they're most likely better preserved than the Bronze Age.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Absolutely. So there are people who have looked in the Neolithic at so in the Neolithic, the Bronze Age, and so on, there's so much more evidence for children. So you've got not only the kinds of things that I've talked about, but you also have little feeding bottles, like little baby bottles, you know, that people are using. You may be more familiar from like ancient Rome, where they have those things, but they actually go way back in time. Yeah, it's not my area, but certainly when I go to these conferences, we have colleagues who are presenting from those time periods as well, and publishing on that material as well, for sure. Sorry, let's see if I can go back into this. And hopefully I haven't lost everybody online.
Yeah, luckily.
Oh, that's still going. Okay, thank God. I thought I had just like totally gotten rid of all of you. Okay.
Actually, yeah, luckily we've all seen it.
Okay, excellent. So we
I'm
can,
not sure if they have any online, if you check to see, because I thought I saw something that as well. But I was curious, I thought that I saw that you had a special on TV, or you were
Mhm.
making a documentary, or something was gonna air on, is it CBC?
so I have two things. So one was on PBS just recently, called Ancient Earth. I don't know if any of you saw that series. It was a 5-part series on the entire Earth. And so as someone who studies humans, I came in at the very last part of the very last episode. I think there was moss, and I mean, literally, I think they went from moss to humans right after. It's like not a big leap, I guess. So, so I'm there talking about cave art. So that's available on PBS Ancient Earth. And then we just finished shooting one for the Nature of Things in Canada called Little Sapiens. And that's based on my book. It just showed nationally in Canada. And we're now, the producers are now working with Nova and Canal Plus in France to hopefully distribute it more broadly. So, but if any of you can get GEM, if any of you do get CBC, you can watch it online through GEM. Yeah,
Thank you.
you're welcome.
I'm seeing just one last question. I think we'll go ahead and close out with this one. There's none on Zoom, so
Okay.
there we go. Anzi takes it.
Was there any clothing associated with the triple burials?
Clothing, no, yes, just personal ornaments with some of with the triple burials. So that's what we have evidence for in those cases. I'm trying to think with those individuals. Some of them have them around the head. So again, suggesting some kind of headgear. And then sometimes you'll also see them. I'm just thinking of our twins, which is not your triple burial, but our twin burial. One of the kids had beads around the pelvis. So probably was a string that's long since disappeared, but probably wearing a kind of belt or something like that around the pelvis. The other way we know about clothing is all the Ice Age figurines. Even in Europe, some of them have evidence for belts or little like bandeau kind of things, and woven headgear and that kind of thing. So
Thank you so much.
yeah, it's my pleasure. Thank you all so much. It's my real pleasure. Thank you.
And thank you all for showing up at OMSI tonight. It's great to see a full crowd. There's still refreshments left, and round of applause to all the people that showed up to the crew, the booths and everything. Thank you all and have a great night. Thank you. Yeah.